everybody, it's Eric Pappenfuss. It's Friday, so it must be a buy day. And today, Kathy, we've come all the way to Canada, haven't we?
Yes.
And we're here to celebrate African American History Month with a discussion of the Niagara Movement. Now, I first became particularly interested in the Niagara Movement earlier this year when we went to West Virginia and Harper's Ferry, because it was there at the campus of Storr College that the Niagara Movement met for the first time on American soil. But its first ever meeting was actually right here in Fort Erie, Canada. If you look out that way, you'll see we're not too far from the city of Buffalo, but they chose to meet right here at this hotel, which is no longer present. Now, the purpose of the Niagara Movement was to challenge the more conciliatory policies of Booker T. Washington and other African-American leaders at the time. One of the leaders of the Niagara Movement was W.E.B. Du Bois, and he wanted to trade in the concept of Niagara Falls as an agent of change. And you can't get anything more radical than Niagara Falls as an image, right? Much better than a slow meandering river. It's a torrent of change. At any rate, there's still a question of, well, why was the Niagara Movement here in Canada? You have any idea?
No.
Well, I mean, it could have been in Niagara Falls, New York. It could have been in Buffalo, New York. And again, historians have speculated maybe it wasn't in Buffalo because of the segregationist or racist policies of the hotel owners in Buffalo. But in reality, if you look at Du Bois's writings, he chose this resort, the Erie Beach Hotel, simply because it was an awful lot cheaper than staying in Buffalo. And that holds true today. Whenever we come up to this area, Kathy, we like to stay in Fort Erie, don't we? As opposed to Buffalo, because it's much, much cheaper. Anyhow, Du Bois rented the entire hotel. And he confessed privately in his writings that if enough people didn't show up to the Niagara Movement, he was going to go bankrupt. He chose it because it was within a stone's throw of some relaxing fishing and some ability to sort of have more of a rural retreat, while at the same time dealing with the very, very important and serious themes that they were going to do. Now, we have two books that are really associated with the Niagara Movement that we're going to look at, but to look at those, we're going to go inside. Why? Well, because we weren't as smart as Du Bois, who decided to meet here in July. We're here in African American History Month, February. But let's go inside and check out those two amazing books. Okay, well, we've come inside where it is much warmer, isn't it, Kathy?
Yes.
And now we can really talk about these books that are associated with the Niagara Movement. 29 individuals came to Fort Erie and stayed back in 1905, including W.E.B. Du Bois and a number of others. No women at that initial meeting. This was a problem, and that was something that would have to be resolved moving forward. But they all came really to discuss a book. And the book they were discussing is this book here, Up From Slavery, an autobiography by Booker T. Washington. And Booker T. Washington was by far the most influential leading African-American intellectual of the day. And this book here, Kathy, was the best-selling book ever written by an African-American at the time. When this book came out, and this had come out the decade before, let's look and let's see it together. Let's take you first to the title page. You can see the frontis with a really nice image of Booker T. Washington. And then you can see the title page, which is 1901. So, but it is a true first edition. And the way that you can tell it's a first edition is because underneath Booker T. Washington's name, it doesn't say author of or other information. They, I think, were a little bit surprised at just how amazing a bestseller this book became. It outsold very quickly Frederick Douglass's autobiographies, which is quite an accomplishment. And it was an amazing runaway bestseller. In fact, it was the best-selling book written by an African-American in a sort of autobiographical style all the way up until the autobiography of Malcolm X.
Wow.
All right, so in 1901 it comes out. It's immediately reprinted again and again. Let me show you one interesting other publishing aspect about the book. You have these beautiful sort of maroon and gold boards, but in the back we have what's called the bookseller's ticket, and you can see that this first edition was actually sold. Where was it sold? It was sold by booksellers in Hartford, Connecticut, Belknap, and Warrenfield. And that shows you just the sort of widespread nature of the book. It was a book for both black and white audiences to read, and it was, again, a runaway bestseller. Now, what Du Bois and Trotter and others were sort of arguing against had to do with a tone of sort of moderation that Booker T. Washington put out. The book begins very famously with the sentence, let's go right to it, "I was born a slave." And it immediately goes into a history of his life and talks about all of his sort of memories of slavery and of his family. And let me just read to you just a little bit about the tone, and this will give you a sense of what the Niagara Movement was objecting to. But Washington wrote, "I pity from the bottom of my heart any nation or body of people that is so unfortunate as to get entangled in the net of slavery. I've long since ceased to cherish any spirit of bitterness against the Southern white people on account of the enslavement of my race. No one section of our country was wholly responsible for its introduction, and besides, it was recognized and protected for years by the general government." And he basically says, no one is going to make me hate, and this was coming out at a time of Jim Crow, a time when individuals were being lynched, a time when race relations were going backwards from some of the progress that was made during the Reconstruction period. And this is what Du Bois and Trotter and others were reacting against. I will say they did agree with Booker T. Washington on one important aspect of the book. They believed in the power of education, and Booker T was one of the strongest proponents of that. From the time that I can remember having any thoughts about anything at all, I recall that I had an intense longing to learn to read, writes Booker T. Washington. I will say one other section of the book which is controversial is the reproduction of some of Booker T. Washington's more famous speeches, including the Atlanta Exposition Address, which is a very famous address he gave. And he says in that address, "We can be as separate as the fingers, yet one as the hand in all things essential to mutual progress." And this was also coming at a time of Plessy versus Ferguson, when people were arguing that separate was equal, and Washington was seen as playing into that by saying we can be as separate as the fingers and the hand. The other book, which I wanted to show you, is sort of the opposite, although it looks very similar. It has a maroon cloth binding. This was a book that did not sell to the masses. This is W.E.B. Du Bois's doctoral dissertation, published at Harvard University, and it is in a library binding that is the first of this new issue, Harvard Historical Studies. He would be the first individual African-American to get a PhD at Harvard, sociology, and this is his doctoral dissertation, which is really cool. Neat. But unlike Booker T's book, which sold millions of copies, this one's amusing because it has this publisher's slip in the front, which basically says that the publishers just want you to know that there will be no trade discounts allowed at all on this book. It's a very, very limited print run. And the book is fascinating. It talks about the history of slavery. And at the time, Du Bois was really trying to grapple with the moral dilemma of slavery. Let me just read you a little bit about this book. "It behooves the United States, therefore, in the interests of both of scientific truth and the future of social reform, carefully to study such chapters of her history as that of the suppression of the slave trade. The most obvious question which this study suggests is how far in a state can a recognized moral wrong safely be compromised?" And that was Du Bois's argument. At any rate, eventually there is a rapprochement between the Bookerites, as they were called, and the Niagara Movement. And the organization that is formed out of the merging of those interests is the NAACP. A good and important history lesson, I think, for Black History Month. Well, let's go back out in the snow, Kathy, for a funny book. Well, no trip to Canada would be complete without a visit to the touristy Clifton Hills section of Niagara Falls. We've got about a foot of snow on the ground behind us, and where better a place to find a funny book for this week's episode? That's right. Our book, fresh off the press, is So You Want to Move to Canada, eh? Well, this is a fascinating book, Kathy, because it'll prepare you for your needs, regardless of what side of the political spectrum you're on. Either you want to annex Canada or you want to flee to Canada, you still want So You Want to Move to Canada, eh? It'll teach you your Canadian provinces. How are you with your Canadian provinces? Okay. Your guide to Canadian cuisine. Yes, there's a whole section on my love of ketchup chips, but also you'll need to learn about poutine and why is milk in a bag. You know, that's what you need to know. But it'll also prepare you for those Canadian book sales, right? Because you're going to be going to the literature section. You're going to be finding all these works by Robertson Davies. Who's Robertson Davies? Or then Northrop Frye in literary criticism, or Emily Carr in art history, or John MacDonald in history. No Civil War, just John MacDonald. So a lot to learn. We're going to end with a trivia question, Kathy, fresh from the book. It's all sorts of good things. This one's an easy one. I'm giving you an easy one. Do you know what the national animal of Canada is? The moose. That's a good guess. It's not the moose. It's not the beaver. It's not even the goose. It is, in fact, the loonie. The Canadian loonie, also found on their dollar coins. Well, thanks for watching. I hope you'll watch next Friday at noon and every Friday at noon for more adventures in the world of books.